The autumn wind carried dust and desperation across the Wyoming plains in 1887, and Martha Henderson walked through it like a ghost haunting her own life. 3 times her body had betrayed her. 3 times hope had grown, only to wither before it could draw breath. The townspeople whispered behind gloved hands about the cursed woman who couldn't carry a child to term, as if her womb were a graveyard that God himself had abandoned. Her husband Thomas had endured the first loss with stoic silence, the second with barely concealed frustration, but the third miscarriage had broken something fundamental in him. "I married you for children, Martha," he'd said, his voice cold as winter stone. "What use is a wife who can't give me sons?" The divorce papers came with the morning frost, and by noon, she was standing on the porch of what had been their home, watching him load her few belongings into a wagon like discarded furniture. Please subscribe to our channel, and let us know what city you're watching from. Your support means the world to us as we share these forgotten stories of the American frontier. The boarding house in Cheyenne had taken her money but not her shame. Mrs. Caldwell, the proprietress, made it clear that a divorced woman was barely a step above a prostitute in respectability. "You'll have the room in the back," she'd sniffed, "and you'll take your meals after the decent folks have finished." Martha had nodded, swallowing her pride like bitter medicine, because pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. For 3 months, she'd sewn dresses for the town's ladies, her fingers working mechanically while her mind wandered to the children she'd never hold. The work paid poorly, and when winter deepened, even that dried up. The respectable women of Cheyenne didn't want their clothes touched by hands that had known such failure. By February, Martha's savings were gone, and Mrs. Caldwell's patience had worn thinner than her threadbare shawl. "You'll need to find other arrangements," the woman had announced over breakfast, not bothering to lower her voice. "I run a Christian establishment, not a charity for barren women." The words hit Martha like physical blows, each one driving her deeper into the certainty that she was truly alone in the world. That afternoon, she packed her single carpet bag and walked out into the bitter Wyoming wind. With nowhere to go and no one who cared whether she lived or died, the road stretched endlessly before her, a ribbon of frozen mud that seemed to lead nowhere but deeper into desolation. She walked because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering the tiny graves that existed only in her heart. Her feet, inadequately shod for the harsh terrain, began to bleed through her worn boots, but she pressed on, driven by a desperate need to put distance between herself and the life that had crumbled around her. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Martha's strength finally gave out. She collapsed beside a weathered fence post, her body shaking with exhaustion and cold. The vast emptiness of the prairie stretched in all directions, and for the first time since leaving Cheyenne, she allowed herself to cry. The tears came in great heaving sobs that seemed to tear something loose inside her chest. Years of suppressed grief finally finding voice in the wilderness where no one could judge her for her pain. It was there, in that moment of complete surrender, that fate intervened in the form of hoofbeats on the frozen ground. Through her tears, Martha saw a rider approaching, his silhouette dark against the dying light. She tried to compose herself, to summon some semblance of dignity, but her body betrayed her with another wave of exhausted sobs. The horseman drew closer, and she could see he was a tall man in a worn leather coat, his face weathered by years under the prairie sun. "Ma'am," he said, dismounting with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle. "Are you hurt?" His voice carried a gentleness that surprised her, devoid of the judgment she'd grown accustomed to hearing. When she looked up into his face, she saw eyes the color of storm clouds, filled with a kindness that seemed almost foreign after months of cold indifference. "I'm fine," she managed to whisper, though they both knew it was a lie. She wasn't fine, hadn't been fine for longer than she could remember, and sitting there in the dirt with tears freezing on her cheeks, she looked like anything but fine. The man studied her for a long moment, taking in her worn dress, her inadequate coat, the desperate exhaustion written in every line of her body. "Name's Jacob Morrison," he said, extending a gloved hand to help her to her feet. "I've got a ranch about 5 miles north of here. You look like you could use a warm meal and a place to rest." Martha hesitated, knowing that accepting help from a stranger could lead to expectations she wasn't prepared to meet. But the alternative was freezing to death on the prairie, and even her battered pride couldn't argue with that logic. "Martha Henderson," she replied, allowing him to pull her upright. Her legs trembled with the effort of standing, and Jacob steadied her with a firm but respectful grip on her elbow. "I don't want to be any trouble," she added, the words automatic after months of being made to feel like a burden wherever she went. Jacob's expression softened further, if such a thing were possible. "Ma'am, out here, helping folks in need isn't trouble. It's just what decent people do." He helped her onto his horse, settling her in front of him in the saddle, and as they rode toward his ranch, Martha felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the simple comfort of human kindness offered without condition or judgment. The Morrison Ranch appeared out of the gathering dusk like something from a dream, its windows glowing with warm yellow light that promised sanctuary from the cold world outside. It wasn't a grand place. The house was modest, built of weathered wood and practical necessity rather than ostentation, but to Martha's eyes, it looked like paradise. Smoke rose from the chimney in a straight line against the still air, and she could hear the distant lowing of cattle settling in for the night. As they approached the front porch, the door burst open and 3 children spilled out, their faces bright with excitement at their father's return. "Pa!" called the oldest, a boy of perhaps 12 with Jacob's same storm-gray eyes. "You're late. We were starting to worry." Behind him came 2 younger children, a girl of maybe 8 and another boy who couldn't have been more than 6, both chattering excitedly about their day. Jacob dismounted and helped Martha down, his movements careful and considerate. "Children," he said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed through love rather than fear. "This is Mrs. Henderson. She's going to be staying with us for a while." The children's curiosity was immediate and unguarded, their eyes wide as they took in this unexpected addition to their household. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" asked the girl, her voice sweet with genuine concern. "Pa always helps hurt folks. He helped Mr. Peterson when his horse threw him, and Mrs. Garcia when her baby was coming, and that time when the Johnsons' barn caught fire and—" "That's enough, Sarah," Jacob interrupted gently, but his smile took any sting out of the words. "Let's get Mrs. Henderson inside where it's warm. She's had a long day." As they climbed the porch steps, Martha felt the weight of 3 pairs of curious but friendly eyes upon her, and for the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was being judged and found wanting. The interior of the Morrison house was simple but comfortable, furnished with handmade pieces that spoke of care and attention to detail. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with books and family photographs. The kitchen table was set for 4, and the smell of beef stew filled the air with promises of warmth and nourishment. It was a home in the truest sense of the word, filled with the accumulated love and laughter of a family, and Martha felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Samuel, go fetch another plate and bowl," Jacob instructed the oldest boy. "Sarah, help Mrs. Henderson with her coat. And Tommy," he addressed the youngest, "you can set another place at the table." The children moved with practiced efficiency, clearly accustomed to helping with household tasks, and Martha found herself seated at the kitchen table before she quite knew how it had happened. The stew was the best thing she'd tasted in months, rich and hearty and seasoned with care. The children chattered throughout the meal, telling their father about their lessons and their chores and the new calf that had been born that morning. Their easy affection for each other was evident in every interaction, and Martha found herself watching them with a mixture of wonder and pain. This was what she'd dreamed of, what she'd lost 3 times over, the simple joy of a family gathered around a table, sharing food and stories and love. "Mrs. Henderson," Jacob said during a lull in the conversation, "if you don't mind my asking, where were you headed when I found you?" His tone was carefully neutral, offering her the opportunity to share or remain silent as she chose. Martha set down her spoon, suddenly aware that she owed this kind man some explanation for her presence at his table. "I was leaving Cheyenne," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on her bowl. "I didn't have anywhere particular in mind. I just needed to go." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was all she could manage without breaking down again. Jacob nodded as if her answer made perfect sense, and she was grateful that he didn't press for details she wasn't ready to share. After dinner, Jacob showed her to a small but clean room at the back of the house. "This was my wife's sewing room," he explained, his voice carrying a note of old sadness. "She passed 2 years ago, consumption. The children and we've been managing on our own since then, but it hasn't been easy." He paused in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need, Mrs. Henderson. No questions asked, no expectations. Sometimes folks just need a place to catch their breath. Alone in the quiet room, Martha sank onto the narrow bed and allowed herself to truly absorb what had happened. A few hours ago, she'd been prepared to die on the frozen prairie, convinced that the world had no place for a woman like her. Now she was safe and warm, surrounded by the gentle sounds of a family settling in for the night. Through the thin walls, she could hear Jacob reading to the children, his deep voice bringing some adventure story to life with dramatic flourishes that made them giggle. The sound of their laughter was like balm to her wounded soul, and for the first time in months Martha allowed herself to hope that perhaps her story wasn't over after all. Perhaps there was still a place in the world for a woman who'd lost everything, a chance to build something new from the ashes of her old life. As she drifted off to sleep, lulled by the comforting sounds of the Morrison household, she didn't yet know that this night would mark the beginning of the most important chapter of her life. The morning sun streamed through the small window of Martha's room, waking her to the sound of children's voices and the smell of bacon frying. For a moment she lay still, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings and the absence of the crushing despair that had been her constant companion for so long. Then memory returned, bringing with it a cautious sense of gratitude for the kindness she'd been shown. She dressed quickly in her worn but clean dress and made her way to the kitchen, where she found the Morrison family already gathered around the table. Jacob looked up from his coffee with a smile that seemed to light up his weathered face. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson. I hope you slept well." The children chorused their own greetings, and Sarah immediately jumped up to pour Martha a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. "I slept better than I have in months," Martha admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Thank you for your kindness. I know you don't owe me anything, and I want you to know how much I appreciate." Jacob held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "No need for thanks," he said firmly. "We're glad to have you here." "Aren't we, children?" The three young faces nodded enthusiastically, and Martha felt something warm unfurl in her chest at their easy acceptance of her presence. It had been so long since anyone had seemed genuinely pleased to see her that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like. After breakfast, Jacob prepared to ride out to check on his cattle, and the children scattered to their various chores. Martha found herself alone in the kitchen, unsure of her place in this household, but determined to make herself useful. She began clearing the breakfast dishes, moving carefully around the unfamiliar space, when Sarah appeared at her elbow. "Pa says we're supposed to help with the washing up," the little girl announced, climbing onto a chair to reach the sink. "I can dry if you want to wash. I'm real good at it. I hardly ever break anything anymore." Her matter-of-fact tone made Martha smile, the first genuine smile she'd managed in longer than she could remember. Working alongside Sarah, Martha began to understand the rhythm of the Morrison household. Everything had its place and purpose, from the carefully organized pantry to the neat stack of mended clothes waiting to be put away. It was clear that Jacob ran his home with the same attention to detail he brought to his ranch. But there was also evidence of the gaps left by his wife's absence. Dishes that didn't quite match, curtains that needed mending, the subtle signs of a household managed by someone doing his best, but lacking a woman's touch. "Ma used to sing while she did the dishes," Sarah confided as they worked. "Pa tries sometimes, but he's not very good at it. His voice is too deep and rumbly," she demonstrated with an exaggerated bass note that made Martha laugh despite herself. "Do you know any songs, Mrs. Henderson?" Martha paused, a wet plate in her hands, thinking of all the lullabies she'd hummed to babies who would never hear them. "I know a few," she said carefully. "Would you like me to sing one?" Sarah nodded eagerly, and Martha found herself humming an old hymn her mother had taught her, her voice soft and sweet in the warm kitchen. By the time they finished the dishes, both Samuel and Tommy had drifted in, drawn by the unfamiliar sound of a woman's voice raised in song. The days that followed fell into a comfortable pattern. Martha threw herself into the household tasks with a determination born of gratitude and a desperate need to feel useful. She mended clothes with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, cooked meals that made the children's eyes light up with pleasure, and slowly began to transform the Morrison house from a place where 4 people lived into a true home. Jacob watched these changes with a mixture of amazement and something deeper that he wasn't quite ready to name. He'd grown accustomed to the constant struggle of managing both ranch and household, of being father and mother to 3 grieving children while dealing with his own loss. Martha's presence brought an ease to their daily life that he'd forgotten was possible. But more than that, it brought a warmth that had been missing since his wife's death. She makes the house feel different, Samuel observed one evening as he and his father worked in the barn. At 12, he was old enough to notice the subtle changes in their household dynamics, the way his younger siblings seemed more settled, the way even the house itself seemed to breathe easier with Martha's presence. Jacob nodded, running his hand along the neck of his favorite mare. "She's been through something hard," he said quietly. "Sometimes people need time to heal, and sometimes they need a place where they can be useful while they're healing." He didn't elaborate, but Samuel was perceptive enough to understand that his father was talking about more than just Martha's obvious need for shelter. As winter deepened, Martha found herself settling into the rhythm of ranch life with surprising ease. She learned to read the weather signs that Jacob taught her, to recognize the different calls of the cattle, to understand the subtle language of the land that surrounded them. The children, initially curious about their unexpected houseguest, began to treat her with the easy familiarity of family, seeking her out for comfort when they scraped a knee or needed help with their lessons. It was during one of these quiet domestic moments that Martha first allowed herself to acknowledge the growing feelings she harbored for Jacob Morrison. She was helping Tommy with his arithmetic when Jacob came in from the cold, stamping snow from his boots and hanging his coat by the door. The sight of him, solid and dependable and kind, made her heart skip in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. She'd thought that part of her was dead, killed by Thomas's rejection and the weight of her own perceived failures. But watching Jacob interact with his children, seeing the gentle strength with which he managed both his ranch and his family, she felt something stirring to life inside her that she'd thought was gone forever. It wasn't the desperate, grasping love she'd felt for Thomas, built on need and expectation, and the promise of children. This was something quieter but deeper, rooted in respect and admiration and the simple pleasure of sharing daily life with someone who saw her as more than just her failures. The realization frightened her. She'd learned the hard way that love could be withdrawn as easily as it was given, that the things she wanted most could be snatched away without warning. But as the weeks passed and Jacob continued to treat her with the same steady kindness, never pushing for more than she was ready to give but never making her feel unwelcome, she began to believe that perhaps this time might be different. One evening in late February, as they sat by the fire after the children had gone to bed, Jacob finally broached the subject that had been hovering between them for weeks. "Martha," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the flames, "I want you to know that you're welcome to stay here as long as you like. Not as a guest, but as part of the family." Martha's breath caught in her throat. She'd been hoping for these words while simultaneously dreading them, knowing that they would force her to confront feelings she wasn't sure she was ready to acknowledge. "Jacob," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the tangle of emotions in her chest. "I know you've been hurt," he continued. He, still not looking at her. "I don't know the details and I won't ask unless you want to tell me. But I can see it in your eyes sometimes. The way you flinch when the children get too close. The way you watch us like you're afraid we might disappear. I want you to know that whatever happened before, it doesn't matter to me. What matters is who you are now, here, with us." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and promise. Martha felt tears prick at her eyes, but for once they weren't tears of grief or despair. They were tears of hope, of the terrifying, wonderful possibility that she might have found not just shelter, but a true home. "I can't give you children," she whispered, the words torn from her throat like a confession. Jacob finally turned to look at her, his storm-gray eyes soft with understanding. "I already have children," he said simply. "3 of them, and they love you. That's enough for me. More than enough." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand in his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "The question is it enough for you?" Martha looked into his face, seeing not pity or calculation but genuine affection and respect. For the first time since her world had collapsed, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps she deserved this kindness, this chance at happiness. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "It's more than enough. It's everything." The spring of 1888 brought changes to the Morrison Ranch that went far deeper than the greening of the prairie grass. Martha and Jacob were married in a simple ceremony in the parlor of their home, with only the children and the circuit preacher as witnesses. There were no elaborate preparations, no white dress or formal reception, but as Martha spoke her vows in the presence of the 3 young faces that had become so dear to her, She felt a joy more profound than anything she'd ever experienced. The children had been involved in the planning from the beginning, their excitement infectious as they helped prepare for the ceremony. Sarah picked wildflowers for Martha's bouquet, while Samuel and Tommy worked with their father to move furniture and create a proper space for the service. Their enthusiasm for the marriage was complete and unguarded, and Martha found herself overwhelmed by their easy acceptance of her as their new mother. "Will you really be our ma now?" Tommy had asked the night before the wedding, his 6-year-old face serious with the weight of the question. Martha had knelt down to his level, taking his small hands in hers. "If you want me to be," she'd replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I would be honored to be your mother, Tommy. All of yours." The boy had thrown his arms around her neck with such force that he'd nearly knocked her over, and she'd held him close, marveling at the trust and love he offered so freely. The wedding night was gentle and sweet, marked more by tenderness than passion. Jacob was patient with Martha's nervousness, understanding without words the fears that haunted her. They talked long into the night, sharing stories of their past lives and dreams for their future together. When Martha finally told him about the miscarriages and Thomas's abandonment, Jacob held her while she cried, his strong arms a bulwark against the pain that still sometimes threatened to overwhelm her. "You're not broken," he whispered into her hair as her sobs finally subsided. "You're not less than any other woman because of what happened. You're the woman who makes my children laugh, who turns our house into a home, who brings music back into our lives. That's who you are, Martha Morrison. That's all you need to be." As spring turned to summer, Martha threw herself into her new role with a determination that sometimes worried Jacob. She seemed driven to prove herself worthy of the love she'd been given, working from dawn to dusk to ensure that every aspect of their household ran smoothly. She tended a garden that became the envy of their neighbors, preserved fruits and vegetables with skills learned from her mother, and sewed clothes for the children that were both practical and beautiful. But it was in her relationship with Samuel, Sarah, and Tommy that Martha truly found her calling. She helped Samuel with his studies, recognizing in the serious 12-year-old a keen intelligence that needed nurturing. She taught Sarah the domestic skills that would serve her well as she grew, but also encouraged the girl's natural curiosity about the world beyond their ranch. And with Tommy, she was endlessly patient, understanding that the youngest Morrison needed extra attention and affection to help him navigate the complexities of his expanding world. The children, for their part, embraced Martha with a wholehearted acceptance that sometimes brought tears to Jacob's eyes. They called her Ma without hesitation, sought her comfort when they were hurt or frightened, and included her in their games and adventures with the easy assumption that she belonged. Watching them together, Jacob often marveled at how naturally Martha had slipped into the role of mother, as if she'd been born for it. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah climbed into Martha's lap, with the unconscious trust of a child who had never known rejection. "Ma," she said, her voice drowsy with the contentment of a long summer day, "will you tell us about when you were little?" Martha's arms tightened around the girl, her heart swelling with a love so fierce it almost frightened her. "What would you like to know, sweetheart?" she asked, pressing a kiss to the top of Sarah's head. As she began to share stories of her own childhood, weaving tales of adventure and mischief that made the children giggle, she realized that she was no longer haunted by the ghosts of the baby she'd lost. Instead, she was surrounded by the vibrant, living presence of the children she'd been blessed to raise, and the knowledge that love came in many forms, not all of them born from her own body. The first real test of their new family came in August, when a drought threatened to destroy the summer crops and force Jacob to sell off part of his herd. The stress of the situation weighed heavily on him, and Martha watched with growing concern as he pushed himself harder and harder, working from before dawn until well after dark, in an effort to save what he could of their livelihood. It was during this difficult time that Martha truly proved her worth as a partner. She took over more of the household responsibilities, freeing Jacob to focus on the ranch, but she also provided the emotional support he needed to weather the crisis. When he came home exhausted and discouraged, she was there with a hot meal and a listening ear. When he worried about their financial future, she reminded him of all they'd already overcome, and assured him that they would face whatever came together. The children, sensing the tension in their household, rallied around their parents with a maturity that belied their years. Samuel took on additional chores without being asked. Sarah helped Martha with the younger children, And even Tommy did his best to be helpful and well-behaved. Their unity in the face of adversity strengthened the bonds between them all, and Martha found herself marveling at the resilience of the family she'd been privileged to join. When the rains finally came in September, bringing relief to the parched land and hope for the future, the Morrison family celebrated with a joy that was all the sweeter for having been hard-won. They stood together on their porch, watching the life-giving water soak into the earth, and Martha felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd lost so much in her previous life, but she'd gained something infinitely more precious, a family bound not by blood but by choice, love, and shared commitment to each other's happiness. As autumn painted the prairie in shades of gold and rust, Martha reflected on the transformation that had taken place in her life over the past year. The woman who had collapsed beside that fence post, broken and hopeless, seemed like a stranger now. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had learned that worth wasn't measured by the ability to bear children, but by the capacity to love and be loved in return. The children continued to thrive under her care, each developing their own unique personalities and talents. Samuel showed promise as a scholar, and was already talking about attending the territorial university when he came of age. Sarah displayed a natural gift for music, and begged Martha to teach her the songs she remembered from her own childhood. Tommy, the baby of the family, grew more confident and outgoing with each passing day, secure in the knowledge that he was loved and valued. Jacob, too, seemed to flourish in their marriage. The lines of worry and exhaustion that had marked his face when Martha first met him had softened, replaced by an expression of contentment that spoke to the peace he'd found in their partnership. They worked together seamlessly, whether managing the ranch, raising the children, or simply enjoying the quiet moments of companionship that made up the fabric of their daily life. One crisp October evening, as they prepared for bed, Jacob pulled Martha into his arms and held her close. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Staying here, marrying me, taking on 3 children who aren't your own?" Martha looked up into his face, seeing the vulnerability behind the question, the fear that perhaps she might one day decide she'd settled for less than she deserved. "Never," she said firmly, reaching up to cup his cheek with her hand. "This is exactly where I'm supposed to be, Jacob. With you, with our children, building this life together. I wouldn't trade it for anything." She meant every word, and she could see in his eyes that he believed her. As winter approached once again, Martha found herself looking forward to the season with anticipation rather than dread. This year, she wouldn't be facing the cold alone or struggling to find her place in an unwelcoming world. This year, she would be surrounded by the warmth of family, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and needed and valued for exactly who she was. The first snow fell on a quiet Sunday morning in November, blanketing the ranch in pristine white and transforming the familiar landscape into something magical. Martha stood at the kitchen window, watching the children play in the yard, while Jacob split wood for the fire, and felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. This was her life now, these were her people, and she had never been more grateful for the unexpected turns that had led her to this moment. The winter of 1888 proved to be one of the harshest in memory, with blizzards that lasted for days and temperatures that dropped so low the water in the wash basin froze solid overnight. But inside the Morrison house, warmth reigned supreme. Martha had spent the autumn months preparing for the cold season with the thoroughness of someone who understood the importance of being ready for whatever challenges might come. The pantry was stocked with preserved foods, the root cellar filled with vegetables from her garden, and every quilt and blanket in the house had been aired and mended. She taught the children to help with the preparations, turning the work into games that made them eager participants rather than reluctant helpers. By the time the first serious storm hit, the Morrison family was ready. During the long evenings when the wind howled outside and the snow piled high against the windows, the family gathered around the fire for storytelling, music, and games. Martha's voice became a familiar comfort as she read aloud from the books in Jacob's collection, bringing far-off places and exciting adventures to life for the children. Sarah learned to play simple melodies on the old piano that had belonged to Jacob's first wife, while Samuel worked on his studies and Tommy played with the wooden toys his father carved during the quiet hours. It was during one of these cozy evenings that Martha made a discovery that would change everything. She'd been feeling unwell for several days, attributing her nausea and fatigue to a stomach ailment that was going around the area. But as she sat by the fire, watching Jacob help Tommy with a puzzle while Sarah practiced her scales, A sudden realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was pregnant. The knowledge filled her with a mixture of joy and terror so intense she had to excuse herself from the room. In the privacy of her bedroom, she pressed her hands to her still flat stomach and tried to process what this meant. After 3 devastating losses, she'd convinced herself that motherhood was not meant to be part of her story. She'd found peace in that acceptance, had built a new life around the children who had come to her through marriage rather than birth. But now, faced with the possibility of carrying Jacob's child, all her old fears came rushing back. What if she lost this baby too? What if her body betrayed her again, leaving her to face the familiar grief of hopes dashed and dreams destroyed? What if Jacob, despite his protestations that he didn't need more children, secretly hoped for a son or daughter of his own blood? For days, Martha kept her suspicions to herself, afraid to voice them aloud lest speaking the words somehow jinx this fragile new possibility. She watched Jacob with the children, noting the easy affection between them, and wondered if he would love a new baby with the same wholehearted devotion. She observed her own body with the hypervigilance of someone who had learned not to trust in happy endings, cataloging every symptom and change with anxious attention. It was Sarah who finally forced the issue. The perceptive 8-year-old had noticed Martha's distraction and pallor, and one morning she approached her stepmother with the directness that was characteristic of children. "Ma, are you sick?" she asked, her young face creased with worry. "You look like you did when Tommy had the fever last year." Martha knelt down to Sarah's level, taking the girl's hands in hers. "I'm not sick, sweetheart," she said carefully, "but I might have some news to share with the family soon. Would that be all right with you?" Sarah's eyes widened with curiosity, but she nodded solemnly, understanding that some things required patience, even when you desperately wanted to know more. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, Martha finally found the courage to tell Jacob. They were sitting by the fire, as had become their custom when she reached for his hand and held it tightly. "Jacob," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think I might be expecting a baby." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and fear. Jacob's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, joy, concern, before settling into something that looked like wonder. "Are you sure?" he asked gently, his thumb stroking across her knuckles in a gesture of comfort. "As sure as I can be without seeing the doctor," Martha replied. "But Jacob, I need you to understand, I've lost 3 babies before. I don't know if I can carry this one to term. I don't know if my body is capable of—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Jacob understood. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close against his chest. "Whatever happens," he said firmly, "we'll face it together. If this baby comes, we'll welcome him or her with joy. If we lose this child, we'll grieve together and support each other through the pain. But Martha, you need to know that my love for you isn't dependent on whether you can give me children. You've already given me more than I ever dreamed possible." His words broke through the dam of fear that had been building inside her, and Martha wept against his shoulder, tears of relief, of gratitude, of the overwhelming love she felt for this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. When her tears finally subsided, she felt lighter than she had in days, ready to face whatever the future might bring with Jacob by her side. The next morning, they gathered the children around the kitchen table to share their news. Samuel, now 13 and wise beyond his years, understood immediately the significance of what they were telling him. Sarah clapped her hands with delight, already planning all the ways she would help with the new baby. Tommy, at 7, was mostly confused about where babies came from but excited by the general atmosphere of celebration. "Will it be a boy or a girl?" Sarah wanted to know, bouncing in her chair with excitement. "Can I help take care of it? Will it sleep in my room?" Her questions tumbled over each other in her eagerness, and Martha found herself laughing at the girl's enthusiasm. "We won't know if it's a boy or girl until the baby is born," Martha explained. "And yes, you can certainly help take care of your new brother or sister. We'll all help. That's what families do." The word families felt natural on her tongue now, encompassing not just the children she'd inherited through marriage but the new life growing inside her. As winter gradually gave way to spring, Martha's pregnancy progressed with a normalcy that both thrilled and terrified her. Each day that passed without bleeding or cramping was a small victory. Each week that brought new changes to her body a reason for cautious hope. Jacob watched over her with the protective instincts of a man who understood the preciousness of what they might be about to receive. while the children treated her with a combination of excitement and reverence that made her feel like the most important person in the world. Dr. Patterson, the traveling physician who served their area, confirmed what Martha already knew during his spring visit to the ranch. "Everything looks normal, Mrs. Morrison," he assured her after his examination. "The baby appears to be developing well and you seem to be in good health. I'd estimate you're about 5 months along, which means you should expect the birth sometime in late summer." The confirmation of her pregnancy brought a new level of reality to the situation. Martha began preparing for the baby's arrival with the same thoroughness she brought to all her endeavors, sewing tiny clothes and blankets while the children offered their own contributions to the preparations. Samuel carved a wooden rattle under his father's guidance. Sarah embroidered delicate flowers on the baby's blankets, and Tommy collected smooth stones that he was convinced would make perfect toys. As her belly grew rounder and the baby's movements became more pronounced, Martha found herself daring to believe that this time might be different. This time she had the support of a loving family, the care of a devoted husband, and the strength that came from having survived her previous losses. This time, she was not alone in her hope and fear. The baby was born on a sweltering August afternoon, arriving with the kind of dramatic timing that would characterize her personality for years to come. Martha had been hanging laundry when the first contractions began, and by the time Jacob could ride for the doctor, it was clear that their daughter would not wait for professional assistance. With Sarah boiling water and Samuel keeping Tommy occupied, Jacob delivered his own child with hands that shook with emotion and wonder. When the baby's first cry filled the room, Martha wept with a joy so profound it seemed to encompass all the grief she'd carried for so long. This was the child she'd dreamed of, the baby who had chosen to stay, the completion of the family she'd never dared hope she could have. They named her Hope, a choice that seemed both obvious and perfect. As Martha held her daughter for the first time, feeling the solid weight of her in her arms and marveling at the perfect tiny fingers and toes, she understood that her journey through loss and abandonment had led her exactly where she needed to be. She was no longer the broken woman who had collapsed beside a fence post in the Wyoming wilderness. She was Martha Morrison, wife and mother, surrounded by love and filled with gratitude for the unexpected blessings that had transformed her life. The autumn of 1889 found the Morrison Ranch bustling with the energy of a family that had grown from 4 to 6 members. Baby Hope, now 3 months old, had settled into the rhythm of their household with the easy adaptability of a child born into love. She was a content baby, quick to smile and slow to fuss, as if she understood instinctively that she was surrounded by people who would move heaven and earth to ensure her happiness. Martha had taken to motherhood with the fierce devotion of someone who had waited long and suffered much for the privilege. She nursed Hope with a sense of wonder that never seemed to fade, marveling at her daughter's perfect features and the way the baby's tiny hand would curl around her finger during feeding time. Every milestone, the first smile, the first laugh, the way Hope's eyes would track movement across the room, was celebrated as the miracle it truly was. The older children had embraced their roles as big siblings with enthusiasm that sometimes overwhelmed Martha with its sweetness. Samuel, now 14 and growing tall like his father, was endlessly patient with the baby, allowing her to grab his fingers and babble at him while he read aloud from his school books. Sarah had appointed herself Hope's primary entertainer, singing lullabies and making funny faces that never failed to elicit delighted giggles from her baby sister. Even Tommy, at 8 still young enough to occasionally feel jealous of the attention the baby received, was gentle and protective when it came to Hope's welfare. Jacob watched his expanded family with a contentment that seemed to radiate from his very being. The man who had once carried the weight of single parenthood and widowerhood now moved through his days with the easy confidence of someone who knew himself to be blessed beyond measure. He would often pause in his work to watch Martha with the baby, his eyes soft with love and gratitude for the woman who had brought such completeness to their lives. "She's going to be spoiled rotten," he observed one evening as he watched Sarah and Tommy compete for Hope's attention while Martha prepared dinner. 4 people devoted to her every whim. That baby's going to think the whole world revolves around her. Martha laughed, shifting Hope to her other arm as she stirred the pot on the stove. "There are worse things than being loved too much," she replied, thinking of her own childhood and the security that had come from knowing she was cherished by her parents. "Besides, we'll teach her to be grateful for what she has and considerate of others. Love doesn't have to spoil a child if it's given with wisdom." As winter approached once again, Martha found herself looking forward to the season with anticipation, rather than the dread that had once characterized her relationship with the cold months. This would be Hope's first winter, and Martha had spent weeks preparing for the challenges of keeping a baby warm and healthy during the harsh Wyoming weather. She'd sewn extra blankets, stocked up on the herbs and remedies Dr. Patterson had recommended, and arranged the nursery to ensure maximum warmth and comfort. The first snow fell on a quiet November morning, and Martha stood at the window holding Hope, pointing out the white flakes to her daughter and describing the beauty of the winter landscape. "See the snow, sweetheart?" she murmured, her voice soft with love. "It's like the world is putting on a clean white dress, getting ready for a long winter's sleep. But we'll be warm and cozy inside, all of us together." Hope gurgled and reached for the window, her tiny fingers splaying against the cold glass, and Martha felt her heart swell with the familiar rush of maternal love that still sometimes caught her off guard with its intensity. This was what she'd dreamed of during all those long, dark months when she'd thought her life was over. This simple, perfect moment of holding her own child and sharing the wonder of the world with her. The winter months passed in a blur of domestic contentment punctuated by the small dramas and joys that made up family life. Hope grew and thrived, reaching each developmental milestone with the enthusiasm of a child who had never known anything but love and security. She learned to sit up just before Christmas, providing the family with the perfect gift as they watched her discover the joy of being able to see the world from a new perspective. Samuel continued to excel in his studies, and Jacob began making inquiries about sending him to the Territorial University when he turned 18. The boy had inherited his father's practical intelligence, but also showed a love of learning that suggested he might be suited for a profession beyond ranching. Martha encouraged his academic pursuits while also ensuring he understood the value of the skills his father was teaching him about managing land and livestock. Sarah, now 9, was developing into a young lady with her own distinct personality and interests. She showed a natural talent for music and begged Martha to teach her more complex pieces on the piano. She also displayed a keen interest in the domestic arts, helping Martha with cooking and sewing while asking endless questions about how things were made and why certain techniques worked better than others. Tommy, the baby of the family no longer, had grown into a sturdy 8-year-old with his father's steady temperament and his stepmother's gentle nature. He was particularly devoted to Hope, often volunteering to help with her care, and showing a protective instinct toward his baby sister that made both Martha and Jacob smile with pride. As spring returned to the prairie, bringing with it the familiar cycle of renewal and growth, Martha reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 2 years ago, she had been a broken woman with no hope for the future, convinced that she had nothing to offer the world and no place in it. Now she was surrounded by a family that loved and needed her, holding a healthy baby daughter in her arms, and looking forward to whatever challenges and joys the future might bring. The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate. There had been moments of doubt and fear, times when the old wounds had threatened to reopen and the familiar despair had crept back in. But with Jacob's steady support and the children's unconditional love, she had learned to trust in happiness again, to believe that she deserved the blessings that had come her way. One warm May evening, as the family gathered on the porch to watch the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Martha felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. Hope slept peacefully in her arms while the older children played a quiet game of cards and Jacob whittled a new toy for the baby. The scene was so perfectly ordinary, and yet so precious that Martha wanted to capture it forever, to hold on to this moment of complete contentment. "What are you thinking about?" Jacob asked, noticing the expression on her face as she gazed out over their land. "You look like you're seeing something the rest of us are missing." Martha smiled, shifting Hope slightly in her arms. "I'm thinking about how strange life is," she said softly. "How the worst thing that ever happened to me led me to the best thing that ever happened to me. If Thomas hadn't left me, if I hadn't lost those babies, if I hadn't been walking down that road that day you found me, none of this would exist. This family, this life, this perfect little girl in my arms, none of it would be real." Jacob reached over and took her free hand in his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "Maybe that's how it's supposed to work," he said thoughtfully. "Maybe we have to lose some things before we can find the things we're really meant to have. Maybe the path to happiness isn't always straight, but it always leads where it's supposed to go." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky and the children reluctantly prepared for bed, Martha knew that Jacob was right. Her path to this moment had been marked by loss and pain and despair, But it had also been marked by resilience and hope, and the kind of love that could transform even the most broken heart. She was no longer the woman who had collapsed beside that fence post, but she carried the memory of that woman's pain and used it to appreciate the magnitude of what she had been given. The Morrison Ranch had become more than just a place to live. It was a testament to the power of second chances, to the possibility of building something beautiful from the ashes of what had been lost. And as Martha looked around at her family, at the life she had helped create through love and determination and sheer stubborn hope, she knew that every step of her difficult journey had been worth it to arrive at this moment of perfect, imperfect, absolutely real happiness. In the years that followed, the Morrison family would face new challenges and celebrate new joys. There would be more children, more seasons of plenty and seasons of struggle, more moments of doubt and moments of triumph. But the foundation they had built together, rooted in love, strengthened by adversity, and blessed by the kind of grace that comes to those who refuse to give up on the possibility of happiness, would prove strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. And Martha Morrison, once Martha Henderson, once a woman who thought her story was over, would spend the rest of her days grateful for the unexpected turns that had led her home to a family she had never imagined but always deserved. In the end, that was perhaps the greatest gift of all, not just the love she had found, but the knowledge that she was worthy of finding it.